Swan, and I'm the Special Collections Education Outreach Librarian at Rauner Special Collections Library at Dartmouth College. Rauner Library is the primary repository on campus for the rare books, manuscript collections, and archival materials of the college. We have about 140,000 rare books. We have about 7 linear miles of archival and manuscript material. We think we're the coolest place on campus. And we're glad that you're here because we want to show you some of those cool things that we have in our collections. Today what I've got for us, I've got two things, or actually two different types of materials. One is an amazing diary, handwritten from 1915. It's written by Thomas Ord Lees, who was a crewman on board the Endurance. And the ship became trapped in ice. They had a harrowing adventure, making their way away from the ship and finding their way to safe land. The other item, actually more of a collection of items, have to do with the West Hartford train bridge disaster, which happened in 1887, one of the worst train accident that has ever happened in the history of Vermont. This is a diary by Thomas Ord Lees. He was a crewman on board the Endurance along with Ernest Shackleton. Ord Lees was hired as the machinist for the ship, not only for onboard engines and that sort of thing, but also because Shackleton was one of the first to attempt to use mechanized ways of getting further into the interior of the South Pole, which was their goal. Ord Lees also at a certain point was made the quartermaster of the ship, which meant that he was in charge of rationing out the daily food. And this happened, really became an issue once they became trapped in the ice. The ship, what they would try to do often is they would try to winter somewhere and then just continue to get as far inland as they could. But what would often happen is that the ice would come up, surround the ship, and then it would start to slowly expand and crush the ship. And that's what happened to the Endurance. And at a certain point, the ice began to tilt the ship and twist the ship to the point where they were having to walk at an angle through this listing ship, which was really their only hope of survival, at least in their minds. Ultimately, what happened was the ship was crushed by the ice. It sank. They had to abandon it, and so they set out on foot across the Antarctic ice shelf, towing 3 lifeboats behind them from the ship. And eventually they made it to the edge of the shelf. They put the 3 lifeboats in the water and they sailed across open water to an island called Elephant Island. And once they arrived at Elephant Island, 2 of the lifeboats were turned into living quarters, and Shackleton, the ship's carpenter, and a few other men made a very, very harrowing trip across open water to another island where they knew there was a whaling station, so there would be whalers there at a certain point of year. They somehow miraculously survived. I don't know how many weeks on the open waves. They were able to maintain contact or get into contact with someone, and then were able to bring a ship back and save the rest of the crew. And the really amazing thing about that is that none of the crew members died, despite there being scurvy and God knows what else going on. Somehow they all made it through. One of the things I really love about this diary is that Ord Lees was, as I said, he was the quartermaster, so he kept track of what the meals were for the day. And you really get a sense of the privations of the explorers' lives at that time, because most of the entries are things like penguin porridge or walrus liver, all kinds of strange things. And then every now and then you'll see they had like some canned fruit or something like that. So you knew that their stores were slowly diminishing. By the end, when they were on Elephant Island waiting for Shackleton to come back, I believe they were eating boiled seaweed at some points because all of their meat reserves had disappeared. One of the other great things about this diary is that Thomas Ord Lees was a decent artist, and so we have these amazing drawings that he did in the diary next to his words. We have images of dog sled teams going out on exploratory runs around the ship. We have images of the entire ship leaning to one side and people trying to essentially walk on the tables and the sides of chairs and that sort of thing to get around. We have really detailed drawings of the layout of the ship and where the water level was and how it was increasing. We also have some amazing schematics of what the lifeboats look like and how they provisioned them before they set out into the open waters. It's amazing that we have this diary, this first-hand account by someone who was a crew member on the Shackleton expedition. This is the actual logbook that he had with him in the midst of the freezing cold when they were trapped in the ice and they didn't know if they were going to get out or not. Shackleton later took this diary and used it to write his official account of what happened. So it's this treasure trove of information about what life looked like while stranded in the Antarctic on a daily basis. You should come in, take a look at this, put your hands on this, and get a sense of what it must have been like to be eking out a survival in one of the coldest places on Earth. So now we're going to look at a different collection of materials, mostly photographs having to do with the West Hartford train bridge accident of 1887. It was the most horrific train accident to date in Vermont. It still actually is the worst train accident that has ever happened in the state of Vermont, which is kind of crazy because it was over, 130, 140 years ago. So what happened was that in February of 1887, this small train was headed north from White River Junction to Montreal, and it had 6 cars behind an engine, 2 passenger cars, a mail car, a baggage car, and I think like a lounge or a dining car at the very back. It was called a Pullman car. So what happened was they started across this expanse, this huge trestle bridge made of wood, entirely of wood, over a river. When the very last car went onto the bridge, somehow it slipped the tracks and went off the bridge, and it pulled the three cars in front of it along with it down onto what at that point was ice. Because this is February. The engine was actually able to get off the bridge and survived okay, and may have taken one of the other cars along with it to safety. But unfortunately, the passenger cars fell down onto the ice. And at that time, they used exclusively oil heat and lanterns and that kind of thing. So it didn't take long for all of the cars to catch fire. 37 people were killed out of 115 people that were on the train. Unfortunately, because they couldn't get to the water, it is this horrible, ironic situation where they were resting on a bed of ice and they couldn't put the fire out. So what we have here are some photographs from that accident, as well as a portrait of Ed Dillon, who was a member of Dartmouth's class of 1888, who sadly lost his life during the accident. You can see here from the photographs, the wooden trestle was entirely incinerated. The fire from the cars came up, caught the entire bridge on fire, and it burned down and left only the stone moorings in place. So you can imagine the heat that must have been generated from that. As a result, most of the bodies of the people who died were charred almost beyond recognition, and some of the photographs here show that as well. I've also got a photograph of what the trestle bridge looked like once they repaired it, so you get a sense of how long this bridge was and how horrible it must have been for all of that to have collapsed and caught on fire on top of the people who were injured and calling for help from the cars below. Despite the horrific nature of this tragedy, there was some good that came from it. This accident got national attention, and legislatures, both local as well as national, were horrified that this kind of accident could happen. In fact, other railroads, such as the elevated railroads in New York City and some other places, were already using steam as well as electricity to heat and to light their cabs or their cars. So the fact that people were still being held or trapped by these archaic technologies was just completely intolerable, unacceptable to people. And as a result, 5 years later, the first national legislation to regulate railroad equipment was passed, and there was a marked decline in the number of passenger deaths from then on out. So these are some of the things that we looked at today. This diary by Thomas Ord Lees and these photographs related to the West Hartford, Vermont train bridge accident. Come in anytime to see these materials or others. You don't have to know what you want to see. You can just come in and say, "What have you got?" and I will show you something cool. My name is Morgan Swan. I'm the Special Collections Education and Outreach Librarian here at Dartmouth College.